Galleria Nazionale di Parma is a sanctuary of frozen time, where the shadows of the Renaissance dance upon polished marble floors. Within these hallowed walls, the air carries the faint scent of aged parchment and oil, a perfume that has lingered for centuries. Among the countless treasures, one face captures the soul of every visitor: the Turkish slave. Parmigianino's masterpiece, with her enigmatic gaze and delicate golden headdress, seems to breathe within her frame, watching the world evolve while she remains eternally poised. To most, she is a priceless artifact of art history, but to Marco she is a silent companion who has shared his life for over 3 decades. Marco is a man defined by his vigilance. As a veteran security guard, his hair has grayed in rhythm with the changing exhibitions, and his footsteps are as familiar to the museum's corridors as the echoes of the patrons. He doesn't just watch the art, he communicates with it, finding a spiritual solace in the stillness that the modern world lacks. Lately, that connection has been fraying. The museum's new administration, obsessed with digital efficiency, sees Marco as a relic. They have replaced human intuition with cold sensors, making the veteran guard feel like a ghost in his own house, invisible and undervalued by those who prioritize spreadsheets over the sanctity of the canvas. During one of his late-night patrols, while the moonlight filtered through the high windows, Marco noticed a flaw. In the transition to the new surveillance system, a microscopic blind spot had been created near the Turkish slave. It was a glitch so subtle that only someone who had paced these floors for 30 years would recognize the 3-second delay in the motion sensor's feedback loop. It was a crack in the armor of the fortress he had sworn to protect. This discovery should have prompted a report, but Marco hesitated. His mind was heavy with a burden far greater than his professional duty. His daughter was fading. Mounting medical debts from experimental treatments had drained his savings and stripped him of his dignity. Collectors were at the door. In this moment of vulnerability, Lorenzo appeared. A man of tailored suits and predatory charm, Lorenzo was a broker for those who desired what the world said they couldn't have. Where he approached Marco in a dimly lit cafe tucked away in a narrow alleyway near the cathedral. With a voice like silk, he offered a solution to erase Marco's debts in a single night. All he needed was the Turkish slave, and Marco was the only one who could provide the access. The moral conflict tore through Marco like a physical wound. For weeks, he lived a double life. By day, he was the loyal guardian. By night, he met Lorenzo in the labyrinthine streets of Parma, sketching maps and timing guard rotations. Every time he disabled an alarm, he felt a piece of his soul chip away. He was betraying the beauty that had given his life meaning. Yet his daughter's face gave him the strength to continue his descent into darkness. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. As the date of the heist loomed, the weight of his choice became an unbearable pressure. On the eve of the operation, Marco met Lorenzo one final time to finalize the extraction point. It was then that the veteran guard overheard a fragment of a conversation between Lorenzo and his lead henchman. They weren't just planning a clean theft. To ensure no forensic evidence remained, and to create a diversion to mask their escape, Lorenzo intended to burn the archives. The realization hit Marco like a tidal wave. They weren't just taking the painting, they were going to incinerate the entire museum. The sanctuary he had spent his life guarding was destined to become a funeral pyre, and he was the one who had handed them the torch. The clock struck 3 in the morning, and the sound vibrating through the hollow stone of the Galleria Nazionale, like a heartbeat in a tomb. Marco's hand trembled as he slid his master key into the heavy iron lock of the side entrance. The metal groaned, a sound he had heard thousands of times before, but tonight it felt like a scream of accusation. Behind him, Lorenzo's mercenaries moved like shadows, their footsteps muffled by thick-soled boots and the adrenaline of a looming crime. They were ghosts in a house of memories, and Marco was their guide, leading them through the darkened corridors where the statues of saints and emperors seemed to turn their heads in disgust as he passed. The silence of the museum was no longer a comfort. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that weighed upon his shoulders with every step he took toward his own betrayal. It's just as they crossed the threshold of the hall of the great altarpieces, a flash of blue and red light swept across the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A police patrol, unlisted on the schedule Marco had meticulously memorized, was cruising slowly through the narrow streets of Parma outside. The lead henchman, a man with cold eyes and a jagged scar across his knuckles, shoved Marco against a marble pillar with brutal force. The group froze, blending into the deep shadows behind the pedestals of Renaissance sculptures. Marco held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched the light fade from the ceiling, feeling the cold indifference of the mercenaries. To them, this was a payday. To Marco, it was the destruction of his world. The tension between him and the hired guns was a physical thing, sharp and dangerous, as he realized he was trapped between the law he had served and the criminals he had invited into his sanctuary. When the silence finally returned, they reached the sanctuary of the Turkish slave. Under the dim emergency lights, the woman in the painting seemed more alive than ever before. Her eyes, filled with a secret, ancient wisdom, met Marco's gaze through the gloom. He felt a crushing weight in his chest as he stood before her. He was about to allow these predators to tear her from the only home she had known for centuries. He realized then that the money Lorenzo promised was a hollow shield against the guilt that was already hollowing him out from the inside. The mercenaries didn't care for the delicate brushwork or the weight of history. They saw only a commodity to be bartered in some darkened room. Marco felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the eyes of the masterpiece judging the man who had failed to be her guardian. As the mercenaries prepared the tools to cut the canvas, Lorenzo leaned in close to Marco, his voice a poisonous whisper that smelled of expensive tobacco. "You've done well, old man," he said, though his eyes held no warmth. Lorenzo's smile was a jagged blade as he revealed the true nature of their exit strategy. There would be no transport for Marco. Once the painting was secured and the fire in the archives was set, Marco was to be left behind as the fall guy. The narrative was already written. A disgruntled, aging guard who lost his mind and tried to burn it all down to cover his theft. Lorenzo's betrayal was absolute and chilling, and he never intended for Marco to see a single cent of the money meant for his daughter's life-saving treatment. Marco was a loose end, a relic to be discarded in the flames. The extraction was brutal and lacked any of the reverence the art deserved. Marco watched in horror as they handled the delicate frame with callous disregard, scratching the gilded wood. When the lead henchman pulled a blade to slice the canvas from its backing, something inside Marco finally snapped. The spiritual guardian within him roared louder than the desperate father. As the thieves moved toward the archives to finish their work, Marco attempted to activate a silent distress signal hidden beneath the display podium. But the lead henchman was faster. A heavy blow caught Marco across the jaw, sending him sprawling against the cold floor. A physical struggle erupted in the hall of the great altarpieces, the sounds of scuffling feet echoing through the vast space as Marco fought to reclaim his honor. Blood pooled in Marco's mouth, but his eyes were fixed on the doorway. Thick, black smoke began to curl through the vents from the archives, signaling that the fire had been lit. The smell of burning paper and ancient wood filled the air, a scent of death for the history around them. Then, through the haze and the chaos of the struggle, a sound stopped Marco's heart. From the main entrance, a familiar voice echoed through the gallery, a voice full of concern and confusion. It was his daughter. She had come to the museum to surprise him on his final shift, hoping to share a quiet moment before his retirement began. She was stepping into the center of a burning death trap, unaware that the father she loved was both the architect and the victim of the nightmare unfolding around her. The smoke was a living entity now, a suffocating black curtain that swallowed the gold-leafed ceilings and marble pillars of the Galleria Nazionale di Parma. Marco's lungs burned with every shallow breath, but the sound of his daughter's voice, echoing through the haze of the lobby, was a sharper pain than any flame. He saw her silhouette, a small, fragile figure standing amidst the swirling embers, calling his name with a terror that broke his heart. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to a single agonizing choice: the woman in the painting or the woman of his own flesh and blood. Marco knew this museum better than his own home. He knew every vent, every secret passage, and every heavy iron gate. Instead of fleeing, he turned his gaze back toward Lorenzo and the mercenaries. They were scrambling near the high-security vault, clutching the Turkish slave as if it were a shield. Marco's jaw was heavy with the metallic taste of blood, but he forced a jagged laugh. "You think that is the prize?" he shouted, his voice a gravelly roar. "The slave is the bait. The gold of the Farnese is in the vault behind you. Go, or the heat will melt the locks." It was a desperate gamble, a lie forged in the furnace of his own regret. Greed, a more potent fuel than any accelerant, drove Lorenzo and his men into the steel-lined room. As the last mercenary crossed the threshold, Marco slammed the heavy lever. The mechanical thud of the vault ceiling was the most satisfying sound of his life. The thieves were trapped in a tomb of their own making, unable to escape. Yikes! With the threat neutralized, Marco turned and sprinted toward the entrance. He found his daughter collapsed near the heavy oak doors, her face pale against the soot-streaked floor. He scooped her into his arms, his aging muscles screaming under the strain, and carried her out into the cooling Parma air. He set her down, seeing the paramedics rushing toward them. She was safe. She would live. But the Turkish slave was still inside, abandoned on the floor of the great hall where the thieves had dropped it in their panic. Despite the shouts of the fire brigade, Marco turned back. He could not let the eyes watching over him for 40 years be consumed by the darkness he had helped invite. The heat inside was now a physical wall, blistering his skin, but he crawled along the floor where the air was thinner. The Turkish slave lay face up, her painted eyes staring at the ceiling as the roof groaned above her. Marco stripped off his heavy uniform jacket, wrapping the delicate canvas in the thick fabric to shield it from falling sparks and water. He pulled the painting to his chest, curling his body around it in a final, protective embrace as the world turned gray. When the firefighters finally dragged him out, they found a man who looked like a charcoal sketch of a human being. His hands were burned, and his lungs were scorched, but he refused to let go of the bundle in his arms. He had saved the art, but he knew the cost of his initial betrayal was far greater than the value of the frame. 6 months later, the Parma sun bathed the Galleria in a soft, forgiving light. Marco stood before the Turkish slave once more. The painting had survived, though a thin scar near the edge served as a permanent reminder of that night. Marco was no longer a guard. He was a man who walked with a limp and the weight of a suspended sentence. He had confessed everything. His daughter's medical bills were being paid through a private trust. His reputation was tarnished, but as he looked into the eyes of the masterpiece, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He had betrayed the sanctuary, but he was the only one who could save it. He had learned that while art is eternal, the human soul is the fire that gives it meaning. Marco turned away, leaving the masterpiece to watch over the next generation.